Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I want to begin by thanking you for all of your attention that you have spent and the time that you've spent over the last 2 weeks listening to the evidence in the case, paying attention to the witnesses, taking time away from your work, your friends, and your family. So I want you to know that we certainly appreciate that. And I think all of us appreciate that. So thank you. Nicholas Kassotis has lied to many, many people. He has left a wake of emotional distress amongst a number of his friends and family. His parents, Linda and Wayne, who you've seen throughout this trial behind him, were shut off by him because he believed that, for some reason, his father, Wayne, was after him. He told people all kinds of lies about his parents, that they weren't his real parents, that he was abused growing up, that his real parents were somewhere in England, that he was kidnapped, taken to the U.S., caused tremendous pain to them. He caused pain to all of the friends that he lied to for those years. And you heard from them. Cameron. On top of the pain for Cameron, he took $200,000 of her money. So you can find, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Nick Kassotis lied to people. That Nick Kassotis took advantage of people like Cameron. You see and you heard what Nick Kassotis did with Samantha Kolyesnik, his third wife. Told her lies. Married her under false pretenses to such an extent that the state of Pennsylvania granted her, or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, granted her an annulment, which, as she told you, was very difficult to get. He treated her terribly. You can find beyond a reasonable doubt that he did that to Samantha. There's no doubt about it. You've heard a lot about Jim McIntyre. I'm sure the state will talk a lot about Jim McIntyre. But this trial is not about whether there is or is not a Jim McIntyre. This trial is not about whether you believe that there's a Jim McIntyre running around or you believe that Nicholas Kassotis committed these crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. This isn't a trial about Jim McIntyre. This is a trial, unfortunately, about Mindy Kassotis and who killed Mindy Kassotis. So I'm going to ask you to look at those facts. Look at the facts that the state has presented and make your decision based on those facts. The GBI did an incredible job in investigating the death of Mindy Kassotis. Agent Sands is a fantastic agent. His partner, I'll call him the partner, did a fantastic job at the crime scene. But they very quickly zeroed in on Nicholas Kassotis. And as far as their investigation of Nicholas Kassotis, it really could not have been more thorough, could it? They pulled all of his bank information. They looked at credit cards, Airbnb documents, a host of exhibits that you will all have access to, showing all of his movements, his GPS movements of his vehicle, everything about Nicholas Kassotis. But what else did you hear? Nobody's perfect. And as great as Agent Sands and his team are, they didn't follow everything, right? Jim McIntyre. They had a number of leads on Jim McIntyre's all over the place. What is the Jim McIntyre lead they followed up on? The one that was convenient. The one that was over here in Savannah, near the law office where Miss Mebane worked. That's the one they followed up on. The crime scene. They picked up a cigarette box that was in the road, halfway between the location of Mindy Kassotis' torso and one of these totes over here. They picked that up. What did they do with it? As far as the evidence that's been admitted, nothing. No follow-up. Why no follow-up? Why no analysis? Why not look for DNA on the box? Maybe find leads. Because they had already decided. As soon as they saw video from that camera of the husband's car near the scene of the body, the investigation for suspects was effectively over. That was it. They had their guy. Nick Kassotis was their guy. They didn't need to follow up on that cigarette pack. How many other cars were captured on that motion camera at the pumping station that day, or over those 3 days that I asked about? Numerous cars. Were any of those cars followed up on? These are cars going by a scene where Mindy Kassotis' body is found. What investigation took place on all of those other people that went by where that body was? Nothing. Nothing. Why not? Because they had their man. He's sitting right over there. He's the guy that did it. We don't need to look into anyone else. All that we need to do is pour all of the resources of the GBI, FBI resources from Agent Bernie with his cast. Let's direct everything into Nick Kassotis, because we have our guy. He did it. When they arrest Nick Kassotis, what does he do? Does he take advantage of his constitutional rights? He's a lawyer. Any lawyer worth a damn is not going to talk to law enforcement if they are a suspect. Any lawyer worth a damn tells their clients, do not speak to law enforcement. You have a constitutional right. Let me tell you all the reasons it's a bad idea. He didn't just have a JD. As you heard the state point out, he's a former prosecutor. He's a former defense attorney. He's speaking to law enforcement. Why is he doing that? Because as totally insane as the Jim McIntyre story is, he has nothing to hide. He lived that Jim McIntyre story. He lived it. This isn't a fiction that the writer, Nick Kassotis, makes up upon arrest. I mean, he's good. He sold a story to Sony, but he's not that good. He's not that good that he could make up a story and then retroactively have lived it. He lived the Jim McIntyre story for years before the arrest, for years before Mindy Kassotis' murder. They actually lived like that. Mindy lived like that. Both Mindy and Nick told people the same story about security details. I don't know whether Mindy necessarily said Jim McIntyre, but they discussed it. They lived it. He didn't make it up later. So when he's arrested, and when Agent Sands and now Investigator Frost go up to Pennsylvania, go up to Lancaster County, and they want to speak to Nick Kassotis, he speaks to them. He doesn't have anything to hide. As a matter of fact, it seems to me he's trying to figure some things out. What's going on here? I thought my wife had died. I'm being arrested for her murder. This is nuts. This is this crazy, Kafka-esque world that he is living in, or he is tormented, played with by someone calling themselves Jim McIntyre. Moving 50 plus times? Who voluntarily does that? Unless they believe there's a real threat on their lives. So he talks to them. He talks to them. Now the state's going to claim that he's inconsistent in what he says, in what Nick Kassotis says. Go in the back. I'm not concerned about any of this evidence. I want you to go back there and spend as much time as you need. Look at everything they have against Nick Kassotis. Look at it all. Study it in detail. Don't rush. Take your time. Take your time. Because his story, what he tells people, is pretty much the same. From the first interview in Pennsylvania to the second interview down here, where he's clearly exhausted from having flown down, tells pretty much the same story. He gets on the stand here. He tells pretty much the same story. Why? I believe it was Agent Sands, or it could have been Investigator Frost, that said, you know the story about Tom Sawyer, it's easier to keep the truth straight. Lies are hard to keep straight. That's true. That's true. And there's a few inconsistencies, but there's been a lot of time. But he tells the same story. He is open with them because he has nothing to hide. Because he did not kill his wife, Mindy Kassotis. So he talks to the investigators. Now, I used to be, for 25 years, purely a civil litigator. And if you are a civil lawyer, you're doing commercial disputes between parties, one of the things you love it when you get it, is to be able to depose the same person twice. A deposition is kind of like an interrogation like you saw. Hopefully y'all have been fortunate enough to never have been deposed. I pray that's the case. It's an unpleasant experience. But you know what you really want to do? You want to be able to depose someone twice. Why is that? Because you depose them the first time, you get all that information, you sit back, you think, well, what didn't I learn? What didn't I ask about? Maybe I can catch some things that are inconsistent. And if a judge gives you the chance to depose them a second time, you have lived a charmed life. That's a wonderful thing. Now, Nick Kassotis was not really a civil litigator. As you heard, he did criminal. But he sat down for a second interview. What a golden opportunity for law enforcement. They've been able to think about all the questions, all the other things that they may not have asked about. They've got more research now. It's been a while. It's been a week or so. They ask them again. They put huge pressure on Nick Kassotis during those interviews. You saw the second one. You heard the first one. I know it's harder to follow the audio. It's not as riveting. But I saw y'all watching the second one. You saw the pressure they put on Nick Kassotis. Law, and I won't use the word lie. Law enforcement is allowed to mislead suspects in an interrogation. There's law enforcement value in doing that. You heard Agent Sands testify about the value in doing that. And they told him all kinds of things that weren't true. That he had DNA evidence at the scene. There's DNA there. You need to just confess, because we got you. Get it off your chest. DNA. Go ahead. Logging truck identified you. Someone saw you there. Confess. Why all the pressure? Why all the pressure? Because the actual hard evidence they have that Nick Kassotis killed Mindy Kassotis is incredibly weak. I think you're looking at pretty much all of it right here, stacked in this corner of the courtroom, right? They've got these tubs. Well, we know from Nick that when they were moving around, they used tubs. Okay, they got some tubs. But what do they have that they talked about since opening? Oh my, they got a knife. There's a knife found near her body. We heard so much talk about that knife. You know, there's a rule in screenwriting and in playwriting. I may get the name wrong. Something to the effect of Chekhov's rule. If you introduce a gun in the first act of a play, it better go off by the third act. The state introduces this knife, this Milwaukee knife, right off the bat. I don't know what y'all were expecting, but I know what I would have been expecting if I were y'all. I'd have been expecting to see some hard evidence tying that knife, that Milwaukee knife, to Mindy Kassotis's, I'm sorry to be so graphic, but her dismemberment. But what did you hear? The exact opposite. That knife was not used in her dismemberment. And again, to be graphic, I mean, her legs were not removed using that knife. That's not what happened. The state's own tool mark, not my expert, the state's own tool mark expert from the GBI. That knife wasn't used to remove those body parts of Mindy. Well, wait a minute. He bought a deer processing kit at Bass Pro Shops. Where's the deer processing kit? They don't have it. Don't be confused. They haven't tried to mislead you. I'm not going to ever accuse them of that. They're too good and too professional. But they went and bought another kit, same model that Nick Kassotis brought. They brought it in here. All right, tool mark expert. What about that kit? Inconclusive. All right, got a deer processing kit that's not even found at the scene, not found on Nick Kassotis, not found at the Airbnb in Savannah, not found in Lancaster, not found. So they're going to bring in another one. They're going to show it here. Inconclusive as to whether that was used. All right. Well, they must have more than that. Oh, they do. They have more than that. They have his car. His car is at the scene near where her body is found. Goes by the pumping station in one direction. Bit later comes back in the other direction. Other cars, as I said, we're going to ignore those other cars. We don't care about those other cars. We got the husband. We don't have to worry about those cars. The Airbnb in Savannah. Okay, there must be something there, right? You don't arrest a man unless you got more than that. You don't do that to somebody. All right, Airbnb. What do they have there? There's a futon that has some of Mindy's blood on it. There's a little bit of blood that appears to have maybe been cleaned up off the floor, and a barely visible amount of blood that you can see with their special chemical substance. You can see that on the wall, a little bit. Not enough to photograph. It's so light you can't even photograph it. But you heard testimony they found a little bit there. But you know what else you heard? How was Mindy Kassotis probably murdered? She had 9 lacerations on her skull. 9. And I asked the medical examiner, there are a lot of veins that run through the skull, a lot of blood that comes up here in your skin. Oh yeah, there are. How much blood are you going to get when you strike somebody with a hard object? Hard enough to do that kind of laceration. A lot of blood. A lot of blood. What about 2 lacerations? Even more blood. That was a testimony. You heard it. What about 9? That's a lot of blood. A lot of blood was not found at the Airbnb. Oh, well wait. He cleaned it up. He did some amazing job of cleaning up all that blood. Did he buy any tarps? I didn't hear anything about that. So he cleaned all that blood up? I mean, that's not reasonable. We asked the owner of the Airbnb, when you came there, did you smell cleaning products? Anything? Bleach? No, she didn't smell anything. All right. Let's keep working for the state. What else do they have? Well, he's a big old liar, right? Let's see. And a deadbeat, right? He owes his first wife $1.5 million. Doesn't give her that. Okay. So, therefore, let me think, this theory. He owes his first wife $1.5 million, so he kills his second wife. How does that work? How does that resolve anything? Okay, forget that theory. Let's try another theory. He kills Mindy so that he can run off to Pennsylvania and go woo and marry his third wife, Samantha. You kill Mindy over that? He knows how to get divorced. He did it once before. He divorced his first wife, Heather. So he knows how to get divorced. He also could just leave. But they're going to have you believe that, I don't know what they're going to have you believe, but I imagine they're going to say, well, he did it so he could run off with Samantha. Does that make any sense? Now, they don't have to prove motive. I don't want to put that in your head. You're going to hear the judge tell you they don't have to prove motive. But they still have to prove that Nick Kassotis committed these crimes, the 12 counts that he is facing, beyond a reasonable doubt. That is an incredibly high standard, beyond a reasonable doubt. You may be sitting here right now thinking, I think he probably did it. I think he probably did it.
Dad, he's calling us out.
That's not high enough in our country. Probably did it doesn't work. I think it's more likely than not that he did it. I really, really think he probably did it. That's my gut feeling. That doesn't cut it either. We have protections in this country. The state has an incredibly high burden to meet. They have to work so hard because they have got to show guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You'll hear the judge explain all of this to you. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you, well, all they have is circumstantial evidence. Like if you watch movies and TV, you'll hear people say, oh, it's just circumstantial evidence. You can absolutely, as you'll hear from the judge, convict people on circumstantial evidence. But that circumstantial evidence still has to show guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And they haven't done that. They just haven't done that. So he's charged with murder. Malice murder. They haven't shown you that he murdered Mindy Kassotis. They showed you he was near where the body was at some point. But they don't have a weapon. They don't have to have a weapon, but they don't have a weapon. Where's the weapon? They don't know where she was killed. They don't know where she was dismembered. All they really have are questions. But they're going to want you to think they got all the answers, or most of them. Now, what are they going to say, I anticipate, about the answers they don't have and the questions that remain? oh, we don't have those answers to those questions because my client did such an amazing job of hiding things, confusing things, obfuscating,
So good and so bad.
trying to keep that evidence around. Well, that argument works no matter who is sitting at the defense table. It doesn't point to Mr. Kassotis. That's an argument that can be made to convict any innocent man. You need to only follow the judge's instructions, look at the evidence you've heard in here, look at what you can take in the back, and decide based on that whether he committed malice murder or felony murder. I think you're going to have difficulty doing that. And the reason why is, frankly, he didn't do these things. Let's look at the other charges. Aggravated assault. You're not going to see evidence that he assaulted Mindy. Now, the state may say, well, just look at the lacerations on her head. That's evidence that he assaulted her. But keep in mind, when the state makes their arguments to you, no one is denying that Mindy Kassotis was horribly murdered and grotesquely dismembered and tossed away. But that is not the only thing they have to show. They have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that Nick Kassotis is the one that did that. Concealing the death of another. Someone tried to conceal her death. No denying that. You don't do the terrible things that were done to Mindy Kassotis unless you're trying to conceal someone's death. That's why you do that. Possession of a knife during commission of a felony. Well, I don't think they've shown any kind of a felony from Nick Kassotis. A knife? Yeah, he had a knife. We all have knives. He had a knife. He bought that Milwaukee knife that who knows where it is now. Mr. Kassotis says it burned up in his car. He bought a knife. Was that knife that he bought used in the commission of a felony? Not that the state has shown. Not beyond a reasonable doubt. The deer processing knives, again. Did he possess those? At one point, he bought them at Bass Pro Shop. During commission of a felony? Not that the state has shown. Tools for the commission of a crime? No. No. Removal of body parts from scene of death. You heard from Agent Sands they don't even know where the scene of death is because how horrible this murder was. Tampering with evidence. Obviously evidence was tampered with, but there's not sufficient evidence to show that Nick Kassotis was involved in that beyond a reasonable doubt. Now you may think I'm clinging to beyond a reasonable doubt, but I point to that because that is the standard that we have. That is the standard that this judge is going to instruct you. That is the high burden that the state has. Mindy Kassotis was viciously murdered and frankly butchered. Everyone
He shouldn't have
should
said
be
that.
upset and beyond distraught over that. It is I don't have the right words for how terrible that was. And then to be cast off, tossed in the woods for animals to rot. Your emotions likely are and should be running high. But I'm going to ask you to do what to me could feel like the impossible. I'm going to urge you to do this. Set the emotions aside. The state has only presented you with one person that you can make pay for Mindy Kassotis' death. My client, Nick Kassotis. So I understand the instinct for justice. I understand the instinct to want to have someone to blame, to want to have someone to hold accountable. But what I urge you to do, is to really serve justice. Really serve justice. And listen to the judge and decide, has the evidence that has been presented to you by this amazing team of prosecutors and investigators, has that risen to the level of proof beyond reasonable doubt in any of these charges? I think that if you can set aside that emotional gut reaction that we all have, especially when seeing these horrible photos, and candidly, logically, rationally assessing the evidence, you will not be able to find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Thank you for your attention, and again, for all the time that you've committed to this case.
Thank you, counsel. Statement concluded.